This is a ZENITH 7S685. So we're going to get started on this. We're going to start taking it apart. We've already done our first look. So we're going to start doing some of the things that are required to make her work. One of the most annoying things about working on an old radio is when the cord is constantly flopping around. So one of the first things I'll usually do is they'll usually need a new cord. And even if they don't need a new cord, that cord gets cut off and I reinstall it, shortening it by a few inches, because otherwise it'll drive you nuts as you're working on it. There, now that's out of my way. Okay, so I've already removed the dial needle. I'm going to go ahead and remove the dial face. Dial face is a 1/4 inch hex head. There are 3 screws, one here in the front, and then there are 2 screws, one on each side. There's a strut here. You just remove the screw from the strut. I'm going to put the screws right back in the chassis. That's the best way I can think of to keep track of them. Boy, this is deja vu, because I just finished one of these a few months ago, and boy did I moan and whine about it too. I think this one's going to be a little easier than that one was, but we'll see. I always think it's going to be easier than it is. I guess that's just my optimistic nature. You know what? I'm going to go ahead and keep these screws out, and I'll tell you why. Because it won't be any time at all, and I'm going to be wanting to clean this chassis, and then these screws are going to come off anyway. Only then I won't remember exactly what they're for. So the best thing to do is put them in their own little baggie, and put that baggie in with the dial face in a baggie. Cable clamp goes right here and holds this tone switch interconnect cable onto the chassis so it doesn't flop around. Next thing, let's get the knobs out of the way. I'm not going to be needing those for a while. The last thing I need to do is chip one of them. So this radio has a peculiar arrangement for the phono and radio switch, in that it is a simple sliding toggle switch right here that is operated by this knob through a small linkage. This is the only ZENITH that I know of that's set up that way. These are little set screws, little standard head set screws on these knobs. Often these knobs are in rough condition, but these particular knobs are pretty good, so he's not going to have to do anything you're not going to have to replace those. I'll just clean these up. There is a little circlip right here, right on the shaft, that holds this bushing, this brass bushing on that this linkage is connected to. This bushing is what the knob screws onto, and then you'll see it operates, it straddles the shaft here. For right now, I'm going to leave that be. Power knob and tuning knob. These usually have 2 screws. Sometimes 1 screw is enough to get it loose, but sometimes it's not, and always better to be safe than sorry and loosen 2 of them. Okay. Of course, the dial cord is broken, as you can see that. So I'm going to go ahead and pull the dial cord out too, and since I'm likely to be working on the knobs at the same time as the dial cord, I'm going to go ahead and store the dial cord spring with the knobs. Okay. Great. This is stripped. One thing I want to show you guys, always when you're working on these radios, while you're handling it, handle it with the condenser plates all the way meshed. That way you stand lower risk of damaging those plates. You see that, how easy it would be to bump those and bend them. Once you've bent them, they can be straightened, but they're a real bugger to do that, a real bugger to straighten. And everybody that who does good videos has mentioned it, so I'll mention it too. Just make sure you close them up, and you'll bump it every now and then. It'll come open. You just check it and close it. You want to keep it that way if you can. I'm going to go ahead and leave this. There's no reason to pull this pulley assembly off of here. I'll just leave it on here. Eventually, I'm going to pull this whole condenser unit off of here with the pulley on it, and I'll clean it. And so I just leave that where it is. So I'm really basically done removing stuff on the top side. Now I get to the fun stuff now on the bottom side. It's going to rest on this electrolytic can. I want to be really careful because I'm going to also be resting on top of this condenser assembly. That's okay to do as long as I cushion it and I check to make sure I'm not going to cause any damage. So one of the things I like to do is put a towel under it. And I'll just rest that on the towel. And that'll just protect it a little bit and keep it from getting banged up. Alright. Okay. Next thing, I'm going to have to remove these escutcheons for these switches, because sure enough they'll get tore up if I handle them and they get banged up. Let me put these knobs in a baggie first. Okay, so I want to remove these, the first of these escutcheons. These buttons here will stay on the assembly. Just make sure I loosened up the right thing. Yep. Okay. There. Okay. This little deal here is the latch for removing the escutcheon from the cabinet. We want to make sure we protect that and keep that in place. Put the screws back into the escutcheon so that they're easier to keep track of. Okay, so what we have here are an awful lot of paper caps. Every single one of these will be replaced. The mica capacitors we'll pretty much leave alone. The larger domino capacitors and these domino wire wound resistors, we will replace those. This resistor I'll check. The last one of these radios I did, this resistor right here, it's a 400 ohm if I remember right, failed. This capacitor right here, it looks like it's smaller mica capacitor cousins, but I guarantee you that's a paper capacitor inside of a plastic case, so that'll come out. The last one I did had problems with the volume pot. I'll check that. I'll check all those things anyway, but I'll pay particular attention to it. There aren't so many wires that are damaged here, and you know these are flexible enough that I can leave these alone. On the other radio like this, every one of the wires look like this guy right here, where you can kind of see. All I have to do is rub it a little bit, and I get pieces of the insulation just falling off. You see that? That's what happens in these early 40s, late 30s, early 40s radios. They're like that. But there doesn't seem to be a whole radio full of them like there was on the last one. And also, on the last one of these radios, there had been some goober in there hacking on this thing and had screwed up the circuitry. So the oscillator circuit was all messed up. The shortwave wouldn't work as a result. I had to go back and look at the schematic carefully and kind of follow it through and put it all back together. So I don't have to worry about that now. It does look like there are some more modern resistors in here. I'm used to seeing dog bones in these radios, but I think this radio was made right. 1942 was right about when they were changing over to these carbon comps. But some of these carbon comps look a little bit new to be original. So it looks like somebody's worked on it, but not extensively. And I'm not going to sweat it. I think it looks like the work that was done was well done. And this might just be a matter of replacing the caps in and out, fix the wires, the few wires that I see that are bad, in and out, and be done. Because I remember, if I remember the initial testing, this radio worked but hummed like mad and had bad distortion. So that all just speaks to caps and resistors. So let's get started on that. You've seen me replace caps and resistors before. I'm going to go ahead and let the video run, but I may not include much of it in the video. We'll see when I put it all together. One of the things I like to do is I'll start at one end and start working toward the other. On a tight radio like this, I don't even bother with the electrolytics till I get all the other crap out of the way. That gives me some room to work. Other folks are the opposite. They like to do the electrolytics first, but all that does is crowd the situation, makes it hard to work. Because the electrolytics, if I remember right, are right about here. Yeah, that's the electrolytic cap right here. So there are I believe three capacitors inside that bugger. Even if there are only two, it's going to be tough because I got to mount them. I'm going to mount them on a terminal strip right in here. Well, the truth is, I want to have this whole tuning condenser done and replaced, and have these grommets replaced before I ever even get to that point. So let's get going on that. First things first, I'm going to try and get this tuning condenser out of here and out of my way. The tuning condenser has some ground straps that are soldered heavily onto the chassis. And the way I usually get those out of there, these are up on a lot of radios, they're right to the floor of this part of the chassis, the flat part. Zenith's smart, and they had these little outcroppings that they punched into the metal. Bought out of solder on this spool of solder. Oh, last year, about this time last year actually, I went into a resale store, a store that basically resells items that have been involved in a shipping accident, like a semi-truck on the road wipes out, splits apart, and all this stuff is strewn across the road. Well, they had a whole bunch of this rosin core 6040 solder. American made, Worthington is the brand, American made stuff. 31 thousandths is the size, 1 pound spools with lead. These are 6040 lead based solder. So they had a whole bunch of these rolls there, and they were priced really well. I think if I remember right, I paid like $7.95 a spool for these things. I bought every single spool that was there. I think there were about 35 spools. I bought them all. I have enough solder to last the rest of my life, I think. And it's good American-made solder. I really, really liked using it. It beats the living daylights out of the lead-free stuff, and it beats the crap out of the new Chinese stuff. So I really got lucky on that. I tell you, man, you stumble on something like that, you got to be ready to just jump on it, because someone else will if you don't. All right, so let's get some solder wick. I wish I could find a deal like that on solder wick. This stuff's expensive, but it's really the best way. I tried one of those Hacko, I think it's called the FR300. I hate that thing because it has to be cleaned all the time. And it's always plugging up, and it's basically a maintenance nightmare, and it's a burn hazard if you ask me. It's so easy to get burned with that thing. I'm not a fan. I know John from Arkansas loves his, but I don't love mine. And for what I spent on it, I could have done better, I think. Okay, so the way you do this solder wick, if you haven't done it, sometimes you heat it up and it'll start to come loose right away. But when you get it good and hot, when you're doing something like this on a chassis, then you get it good and hot and melty, and you get as much into the solder wick as you can. And the more you get off of there, the easier it is to keep the rest of it hot. And the reason I'm trying to soak it out of the wire, even though it comes loose without soaking it out of the wire, is because at some point that I'm going to want to put that wire back there, and it's going to be filled with solder and hard to work with. So I try to get the solder off of it right away. But it's coming loose pretty easily. Also, when you pull it out, try and get the wire straight. Or try and keep the same exact shape that you had before. That's even better. But that's hard to do sometimes. This one, I think it cooperated, and it'll slip right over that spot again. I won't have to do much. So there's number one. There's usually 2 or 3 of these. It just depends on the radio. Naturally, this one's in a tough spot. I buy the larger solder wick, by the way. I think it's 21 hundredths, or almost 1/4 of an inch wide, 0.21 inches wide. Rosin, filled solder, whatever, rosin dip solder, made by MG Chemicals is the one I usually buy. Solder wick, I think they call it. Anyway, it's good stuff. And I happen to like buying that from Amazon, although I'm always on the lookout for alternative sources. We've got 3 signal leads to release, and the third ground on this radio is attached to a lug here. So what I will do is just unscrew that lug and leave that soldered on, because there's no point in removing solder from that if I don't have to. Now I like to put the screw back because, well, actually no, because this is one of the screws that holds this tuning condenser on. So I'll set it aside for the moment. This other one also has a grounding strap on it, and this lug is loose. Isn't that interesting? Okay, so I'll go ahead and remove those while I'm thinking about it. Okay, the looks like dark green and this sort of yellow with the dark green stripes that goes up to the switch here. That goes to the terminal lug that is farthest away from the pulley. Okay. This black one, there's a black wire, you see me wiggling it. Okay, this black one goes all the way up here, wraps around the bottom of the band switch, and attaches right up here to this bus wire. Okay, goes all the way around under the band switch and over to the middle terminal for the tuning condenser. And then finally, there's a green one on the lug closest to the pulley. This green one comes up here to the oscillator coil right here. Okay. So green one to the front to the oscillator coil. Black one in the middle wraps around under the band switch and goes up here to this little bus wire. And then finally the yellow with the gray or dark green stripes goes to this lug farthest away from the pulley and goes up to the band switch here, and it has a similar color wire leading away from the band switch. Looks like it's going way over here to the RF amplifier tube over here. You can see it. Alright, let's go about desoldering these 3 antenna leads. I'll go ahead and desolder these antenna leads, and then I'll drop the tuning condenser down off of the chassis, and I'll set it aside for now so that I can do some cleanup on it later. After that, I'm going to get to work on all these capacitors. You've seen that before. There's no reason for me to bore you to death with all of that work. So next time you see this chassis, I'll probably have, I don't know, at least half of these capacitors done. I'll check in with you to let you know what progress is. But for now, and for part 2, that's all I got. So from Salt Lake City, this is Michael. That's all for now.